In 1971, director Piers Haggard made a film about an innocent, rural 18th century English village being corrupted by something ancient and evil lurking just beneath the soil. This was the first film on record to be labelled folk horror, a term coined by a journalist during the making of the movie, which would then be referenced by the director Piers Haggard many years later. However, the studio that made this folk horror were particularly keen to draw on a number of themes, conventions and aesthetics from another film made 3 years previously, a disturbing British horror movie starring Vincent Price about a rural village that's invaded by a corrupt and evil man who inflicts pain, suffering and torture upon its innocent, unassuming villagers. Join me as we continue exploring the evolution of folk horror, and we delve into 2 British folk classics, The Witchfinder General and The Blood on Satan's Claw. Welcome back to the Evolution of Horror. My name is Mike, and as ever, I am your host. If you're tuning in for the first time, then welcome. In this podcast, we explore and dissect the evolution of the horror genre by looking at particular subgenres across a number of weeks. We are currently in the midst of exploring the evolution of folk horror, and this week, as the intro suggested, we're delving into the 2 biggies, the 2 originals, ground zero for folk horror, The Blood on Satan's Claw and Witchfinder General. Now, we will be talking about both these movies in spoilerific detail. These will be deep dives in which we will reveal everything that happens in the story all the way up until the end. So if you haven't seen these 2 incredible movies, then do yourself a favour, give yourself a treat, go away and watch them, and then listen to our review. Lots to cover, but before we get started, here are a few contact details. You can email us. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter @evolutionpod or on Facebook. That's facebook.com/evolutionofhorror. You can also follow us on Letterboxd @evolutionpod, and that's where you can keep up to date with what movies we're going to be covering in detail over the next few weeks. But let's get started. To join me to discuss all things folk horror is somebody who's already been on the podcast once before. She's a film producer. She recently produced Alice Lowe's directorial debut Prevenge, and she also produced the incredible folk horror, one that we're going to be covering in a few weeks, The Borderlands. It is my great pleasure to welcome back to the podcast Jen Handorf. Jen, welcome back.
Hi there. How are you doing?
Very good. How have you been?
Good. Busy. I got to spend while everybody else was off watching the royal wedding, I was at the British Tarantula Society exhibition.
Oh my god! Now, yeah, I remember last time you were on the podcast, you mentioned this as something you had coming up, some kind of spider documentary or something.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a documentary about the British tarantula keeping community, which
who knew that was a community?
I know it's incredible, and it really is as well. It really is, and just some of the fantastic people who are a part of it, and the exploration and the it's just absolutely spectacular.
Crazy.
My new favorite fun fact is that apparently the first tarantula in the UK came over on a wine barrel in about the 1780s and was promptly crushed by a cardinal's bicycle.
Who knows this stuff?
I know, right? How amazing is this?
Yeah, how did anyone know that happened? That's crazy.
Dear diary, today a bloody big grey 8-legged thing came out of the wine barrel.
Yeah, a kind of 8-legged mouse came out of a barrel.
I crushed it because it was clearly of Satan.
Yes, exactly.
An ungodly creature.
So is this doc like... Is it like a kind of loving look at this world, or is it like, holy shit, this is terrifying?
No, it really is, because it's actually, the fear of these things is both really natural and also completely unnecessary.
Yeah.
There's over 400 species of tarantula, and none of them are venomous to humans. Some of them, it might hurt like hell, but you're going to be fine. There's no more dangerous than a bee sting.
Right.
So yeah, it's just really incredible. I've spent a lot of my time making horror films, making up things that people are really frightened of. And things that are designed to be feared. So it's quite nice going into something which we sort of naturally fear, but really shouldn't have any concerns about at all.
Are you arachnophobic, or were you?
I go back and forth. I'm one of these that I'll be the most arachnophobic person in a room, sort of a thing. Like if somebody's getting really upset because there's a spider hanging out, then I'll go deal with it. But if I'm in a room full of tarantula keepers, then I'm a little more reticent to go put my hands on it.
Yeah, I think I'm exactly the same, actually. Like, I'm not a big fan of spiders, but if I'm with somebody who's truly can't be in a room with one, I can suddenly go, oh, that's fine, I'll take care of that.
Yeah, there's a weird sort of like leadership machismo that sort of comes out of like, you sort of convince yourself. It's like, oh, they're being ridiculous. I'm totally brave in this situation.
Yeah.
Cut to the next day.
Exactly. Yeah. I just like to know where they are at all times. That's the thing. What I don't like, recently I woke up...
Ninja spiders.
Yeah, recently I woke up with one on my arm. And you know there's that feeling in the middle of the night when you're like, oh, I think I'm being tickled by a hair or something, and you kind of scratch it off, and then you kind of come to and realise, nope, that is something crawling around on my arm.
It's one of those impromptu breakdance moves.
It was an absolute jump out of the duvet, impromptu, breakdance. Yeah, exactly that.
Sort of Morris dancing come fish slap dance kind of a thing.
Exactly.
It's that sort of like, where's my wallet, where you pat your body, but like in a much more aggressive scenario.
And then once that spider had gone, it was take the duvet off the bed, take the pillows off, like scout the sheets, make sure there's nothing else there. It's that thing
when it's like when someone says nets, like the second you think about it, they're everywhere.
Exactly.
And I should say too, like, when I say love or dislike spiders, they're incredible creatures. And the more I get into this as well, the more I'm discovering how, God, I sound like I'm pitching a documentary already, but just how incredible they are for the ecosystem, and how vital they are for it, and how old they are, and how just they're these really incredible things that people don't get. Well, people haven't bothered to get to know because of that initial fear. And I think that's a really... Heck, there's a lot of stories coming your way. I'm telling you that.
Isn't it interesting? And we will get off spiders in a minute. But what is it about? Why is it such a fear? Why is there such a universal fear of spiders above anything else?
This is part of what we explore. But there's that element. And we talked about it last time I was here. Actually, that element of the uncanny.
Yeah.
They don't move like they're supposed to.
Mm-hmm.
They have loads of eyes.
Yes.
So they're sort of mythologically designed to be a little bit off-putting. And it's as you said as well, it's like, if you know where it is, but they can be fast, they can be skittery. And it's just, I'm sure there's people listening right now going, okay, seriously, I can't cope with this anymore. Can you stop talking about how spiders move?
It's exactly. But it's like, if anyone in a horror movie designs some sort of monster or alien, it always will have lots of legs or lots of eyes. They look like spiders.
Well, exactly.
A lot of the time.
And there's that sort of creepy crab walk as well that spiders and crabs share. Like you can imagine it is like in The Exorcist.
Yes,
all that
exactly.
Kind of stuff.
Exactly.
Like it is. It's an interesting one. Like just something that we are historically, biologically hardwired to be frightened of.
Yeah.
That is actually, and in Britain especially, because you don't have any local poisonous insects or poisonous spiders.
There is no reason to fear them in the UK. Really.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so it's quite it's an interesting one anyway. We'll figure it out.
It's hilarious. One day on this podcast I'll do Arachnophobia, the film. That would be great.
Oh my God.
Great film.
So good.
Yeah.
So good.
But anyway, so we're talking about folk horror now. So this is a weird one because it feels like folk horror is quite a tricky thing to define. And obviously the two movies we're talking about today have kind of been universally agreed that they are folk horror, these two films.
Well, and especially with Witchfinder General, it's meant it's the founding father, and also I think really one of the most problematic films to categorize in this genre as well.
Interesting. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts. But there was obviously no thought at this point, was there, when they were making Witchfinder General or Blood on Satan's Claw, like, oh, we're making a movie of this subgenre or with these conventions or whatever.
Yeah, it sort of is. I think a lot of times folk horror sort of is what people want it to be. Yeah. Because I think that's sort of, as far as I can track it, that seems to be how these definitions came about. And it's the thing that I find is so interesting at the heart of it, and we'll get into the film specifically, but the thing I find interesting at the crux of it. So we had Witchfinder General came out. Yeah. It did very well. It had a strong cast. All the dramas that films usually have about cast and director not getting on. But,
all the kind of myths behind
it. Exactly. And it is one of those that does have those kind of serious myths behind it. And obviously, you get any film with Vincent Price, it's gonna make an impact.
Totally.
But so that came out. It did fairly well. It got some attention. It kind of rose to the top. And then Blood on Satan's Claw was very much done as a response to that. They had this. The producers had this slot that they had booked that needed to be filled with a film. And the writer said, "Oh, I've got these sort of short stories." And again, this is Blood on Satan's Claw we're talking about.
Yes.
He said, "I've got these sort of different short stories, and they're all inspired from me growing up in these sort of idea of horrors that I experienced or things that I feared then." And we could put them together, and eventually they did eventually turn those 3 stories into one story.
Yeah.
And even the producer, who was also the producer of Witchfinder General, even had them write in certain scenes, certain elements that were beloved by the audience for Witchfinder General. So, for instance, when they start reading from the Book of Witches, that was apparent. Like, oh, put the Book of Witches in. People liked the Book of Witches last time.
Interesting.
And the same thing with the drowning of the potential
that's
witches
the real.
well.
In some ways, that's one of the only scenes where I felt like there was a kind of link, because actually, otherwise, they're very different in the story and what happens, the themes. It's like, and then it's like, well, what is a folk horror then? It's almost more to do with the kind of aesthetic or something, isn't it?
Exactly.
It's the English countryside and
exactly. So it's exactly as you say, that these films, which are historically linked and commercially linked and creatively linked in content, it's really just the era and the word witch. Because you wind up with Witchfinder General, which is effectively a historical drama. I mean, the thing it most reminds me of is The Crucible. Which even though I suppose if you think about it, yes, The Crucible could be made as a horror film or a horrific play. It's a drama. I mean, it's a straight up drama. It was could not have been more of a snooze fest when I read it in high school.
Yes, everyone hated reading it at school. Yeah.
But now that I know it's a horror novel, maybe I would enjoy it more. I didn't realize it was a horror novel at the time.
No, you're pre-programmed to hate what you have to read at school.
Exactly. But then why do we not speak about The Crucible as a horror film or as a folk horror? And that was obviously written in the 50s. It was written around the same time. But it's really interesting because there's no supernatural elements in the Witchfinder General.
No.
It happens in the real world. The horrors are very real world.
Yeah.
It's an account of things that happen to people.
Absolutely. It is. It's like they can be anything, these films, because some of them are absolutely, straight up supernatural, and Blood on Satan's Claw, that kind of thing. It's like there is something proper, occulty, going on. And then a lot of them are also The Wicker Man, Witchfinder. It's actually how evil people can be, or the psychology of people, group psychology, communities, that kind of
mass
thing.
hysteria.
Yeah, all of that kind of thing as well. And it's really interesting.
The themes are definitely there. I feel like there's definitely themes of power, of mass hysteria, of paranoia, of the corruption of the innocent is a big one, I think.
Yeah.
But it's, again, if you look at the village citizens in Blood on Satan's Claw, and you look at the citizens of Summer Isle, they're, the citizens of Summer Isle are these scheming villains, whereas you go to Blood on Satan's Claw and they're these innocent victims. They're completely corrupted by someone. So there's not even this common theme of who is the countryside good, is the countryside bad?
Yeah, exactly.
Are the old ways good? Are they bad? There's no consistent message throughout the films. I was thinking as well, because part of me wanted to say, okay, so it's about an era. We say Witchfinder General, which I don't know. I think you have to give it a pass as far as being a folk horror. I don't think it is.
No,
but it started. So that's the paradox, isn't it?
It is. I 100% agree with you. Yeah, I don't. It's the least, especially of these ones that are all kind of universally agreed are folk horror. I think it's the least folk horror-y in a weird way.
Well, exactly. But it set a visual tone, maybe, and a sort of design, and because it was the film that inspired Blood on Satan's Claw to be made. If not, as a direct narrative, then certainly from a production development sort of thing. It was a film that was made because a previous film had worked in that same arena.
Yeah.
And then you look at Blood on Satan's Claw, and that is folk horror. It's supernatural. It's small town. It's girls with flowers in their hair killing people.
And also it feels like Blood on Satan's Claw feels like a folk story that would have been told at that time. You know, like it feels like these are people, that's the story of, you heard about this village and there was a satanic presence and the children became ungodly and a priest had to come and save them, or a judge or whatever. Whereas Witchfinder General feels very much like a modern day look at how awful humans were to each other, like a historical look back. You know?
Exactly. And it opens up. There's a couple other films I wanna put to the test, because I think it helps us get to the definition when we talk about what is or what isn't. So I'm gonna say a couple of films, and you tell me if you think they're.
Go on.
Let's play a game.
I love it. Yeah. Go on.
So The Devils. I know, right?
The Devils is, I can't argue against it really. Because if Witchfinder General,
Well, that becomes the problem. If Witchfinder General is, then The Devils has to be, because The Devils is perhaps slightly more supernatural, or if it is at all.
Yeah.
But tonally, setting-wise, image-wise, tonally, mass hysteria, religion, the old ways, someone singled out, perversion of innocence.
Yep.
It's got all of that in it. Okay, so we're gonna go the other direction now. I'll assume that we've sort of left that one up there.
I know, because then I suddenly go, oh gosh, I should add that to this podcast, because I'm not covering it.
And it's that thing as well. Okay, so if the film that started the whole thing, if it's so similar to the film that started it, then how come it can't be one?
Yeah.
Then okay, so leaving that side of that bit of the Venn diagram aside, Troll Hunter.
I think Troll Hunter is a folk horror.
Do you?
Yeah, in some ways I do, because I think it draws on traditions and folklore of that specific country.
See, I do. I agree with you there, and that's why I put it on the table. But I just feel like the feel of it and the tone of it is in the wrong place.
Well, do you know what? I'm going really kind of loose with the term for this series, because basically in my head I've decided that folk horror is going to be about rural settings predominantly, and often about the rural landscape and setting.
I'm with you.
But it can be set either in the past or modern day. I mean, Wicker Man was set in contemporary Britain, as far as we're aware, So it doesn't have to be historical necessarily, but it has that kind of the impending oldness coming through, I suppose, into the modern day. And insular communities who are kind of cut off from society, and then usually, although that's not really the case even with these films we're about to talk about, but it would often be that maybe an outsider will come into this community and will kind of suffer the consequences because they don't live by these old ways in some way. I've got
another one for you.
Yeah, go on.
Straw Dogs.
I'm doing Straw Dogs.
Are you doing Straw Dogs? So this is really interesting.
So this is where I open a can of worms, because basically I'm going to do Straw Dogs and I'm going to do Deliverance.
Okay.
And then we go into this whole
really
era of like what some people call hicksploitation, essentially. Like almost like, is that the US equivalent? So Texas Chainsaw, or where you've got whole communities of people that all might be, the Hills Have Eyes. These people kind of stumble into this town and can't escape, and it's that feeling of being in a trap as well.
Yeah, the seclusion and the sort of...
Yeah, and again the real emphasis on the setting, the kind of stark, brightly lit. Often they're shot on locations. They're not going to be shot on kind of sound stages as well. They're usually
as you say, like it's the countryside. It's not urban.
Exactly, it's not
agricultural.
Urban. Yeah, so I'm going all over the place with this series. We're going to be starting with these three films that everyone kind of agrees for some reason is folk horror.
I know, right?
And then we're going to Straw Dogs. We're going to all of that kind of stuff. Deliverance, Blair Witch Project. Everyone says is folk horror.
So, well, that to me is. I almost feel like that's one of the more obvious ones, because I feel like when you get into the sort of so you've got the people in the woods. They're trespassing. They're discovering a world. They've been warned not to go there.
Yep.
There's a folklore around it with the old what happened in the years past.
Yep.
And then even, I mean, I feel like anytime you can use figures crafted of sticks,
yes.
I feel like that's the bottom line, really.
Always.
If sticks and straw can be a large portion of your production design,
yes.
you have made a faux car.
Exactly that.
I feel like you really should do. You should do a list of all of them and then find the one thing, and it's going to be sticks and straw.
Well, that's what I'm going to find really interesting, I think, over the next few weeks, because I think with, slashers and ghosts, it's like you know what you're getting, you know what films to cover, really. Whereas with this, it's going to be basically like I'm learning as I go what a folk horror is, really.
Well, it's not really established, is it? It's such a new term, and as you say, it was coined to bring together these what are actually in truth quite disparate films.
Yeah, totally.
And it speaks to a mood and a tone.
Yeah.
As much as anything else, but
I think it is. I think mood and tone are a big part of. I think that's the only thing really that you can mood, tone, and look and what you see on screen, the kind of mise en scène, the aesthetic.
Yeah,
I think
there's a sort of uneasiness as well.
Yeah,
and it's so funny though because you don't tend to like group films by that kind of classification.
No, you don't. You don't.
When you think about. I mean, like you say, you think about the slashers, it's very clear. And even when you think about like the 1950s or the communist paranoia films, you think about them, but you don't think about them as being part of the same group. They just all happen to have some of these same elements.
Exactly.
But these folk horrors, and there's part of me that feels like it's just a way of saying this is a group of films that Mark Gatiss likes, and I'm totally fine with that. And if that's what if that's how we describe them, then I want to watch all of them, and I'm totally fine with that, and that's all I need. But it's so ephemeral, isn't it?
Totally.
And you know what, as well, these take place in the day a lot more. I'm just thinking about compared to like slashers, for instance.
Totally. Slashers tend to be, I think, kind of suburban. You think of Haddonfield in Halloween, like kind of modern suburban, residential. Often dark, and obviously ghost stories. We talked about The Innocents and The Haunting last time. Very dark, gothic, shadowy, lots of shadows. All of that kind of thing. And I think these films are stark daylight for most of them as well.
Countryside and just beautiful vistas. Like really, which for Blood on Satan's Claw, the cinematography on that in particular,
it's wonderful. Yeah,
it's just these beautiful sort of paintings.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, there's a guy, Adam Scoville, I think it's Scoville, who's written a book on folk horror, and he basically boiled it down to four things that he called the folk horror chain. Okay. And he sort of said, first of all, point one, a rural location.
Okay.
Point two, this, and basically one thing leads to the next. Rural location. Point two, isolated groups.
Okay.
Which then leads to point three, skewed morals and belief systems. And then finally, point four, supernatural or violent happenings.
But then Witchfinder General's not one.
It doesn't. I mean, I suppose the one thing that Witchfinder General has, which we will get to this film properly in a bit, but I suppose it's that feeling of whole towns will all, there's nowhere to run, I suppose. If you're accused of being a witch, the whole town goes with it and they all come and watch you die,
That was actually, talking about the traveling, that was something I found really interesting in Witchfinder General, is they do go from town to town in it.
Yes.
And I didn't grow up in the UK, but I loved how they're going from tiny town to tiny town, and they're riding on horseback and there's this sort of pursuit.
Yes.
And there's all these people pass. Oh, you just missed him.
Yes.
Like it's all this kind of.
Yes.
But the idea, I don't know that I would say it's that the world of the film is that isolated.
No,
because even the hero sends his wife off to his aunt's house, and it just follows them to that village as well by coincidence.
I guess it's that each within these villages, it feels quite isolated. I mean, they say at the beginning, don't they, there's a kind of explanation of, it's the English Civil War, and there's kind of chaos, there's no kind of looming national authority anymore, and so it's like magistrates and specific town and small village that hold all the power.
It's very feudal, isn't it?
Feudal, exactly. So again, I suppose it's that regressing back to these random people like Matthew Hopkins who come in and can just say this is happening and the whole town go with it.
And I think this is where the power comes from, like the idea of who holds the power, because it's obviously you're doing a whole other thing on the Wicker Man, but you look at Wicker Man and it's a police officer coming into somewhere and suddenly he has no authority.
Yes.
And you look at Witchfinder General and this is someone who has absolute authority. Vincent Price's character is the Witchfinder.
Yeah.
Later in the film promoted to Witchfinder General.
Yeah.
He gets promoted. I love it. like,
and it's basically like self-appointed as well. Like, you know, he just calls himself this.
He's
it's
not
brilliant.
been voted in.
No,
he's just
no.
like, yeah, well, I'm the Witchfinder Colonel.
Yeah.
Is that good?
It's so interesting because the other characters in it are all characters that could at that time have been in positions of power. So you have a priest and you have soldiers and magistrates. Yeah.
Everyone's a bloody magistrate.
Yeah.
They're always there is in both of these films.
Yeah.
I feel like I need to figure out who these magistrates are. They seem to be the people at the center of everything.
Yes, exactly. And the only other thing I will, before we get into these films as well, folk horror, you know, as we've mentioned, it seemed to have this kind of, well, whether or not, obviously it wasn't established as folk horror then, but there was this moment of these kind of rural historical horror films back then. And it feels like right now, it's back. Like, people keep talking about some sort of folk horror resurgence with movies like The Witch and The Ritual and Wakewood and all these types of things, and Ben Wheatley's movies as well. I mean, why do you think that is? Do you think there's a reason for it?
Well, I think I would say, one, I'm not sure that they ever stopped being made or did much more than go out of fashion, really.
Yes.
And I think as we've sort of pointed to, I think maybe films just stopped being defined as folk horror. Because like you say, you know, you look at something like Deliverance or those kind of films coming out through the 70s and 80s. And then even if you think about, you know, Ben Wheatley's films, that's been over the last 10 years, these films, and The Witch as well. And so I'm not sure that it's as cyclical as maybe it looks to be. I think when you begin to delve into what is the actual definition of this. But then conversely, it's really interesting, why are we choosing to define these films in this way at these times? And I think too, like, there's, when we talk about pop culture is about the connectivity and, you know, about knowing exactly what everyone else knows and having an opinion on what everyone else has an opinion on. Yeah. Whereas when these films are completely disconnected from that, and there's a fear in being disconnected, I think
there is.
That you know, I think if you look at these films when they came out originally, it was probably a rebellion against the youth movements and the sexual freedom movements and those kind of things, saying, you know, look at these, especially look at Blood on Satan's Claw, look at these crazy free-loving kids. They're definitely got the devil in them. Yeah. Whereas when you look at, you know, the more recent versions of these kinds of films, they're much more about city versus urban. Yeah. Sorry, city versus agricultural, rural versus urban. So I think, you know, I don't think there's any one answer really. No. I think because these films are so varied, I think they are responding to variable themes and topics. But I mean, it is that element of isolation, which is probably more consistent in our culture than we really want to admit, really.
Yeah, it's true.
With the tranquility of rural England shattered by civil war, evil was spawned at a time of strife in the land.
Take him, Stern. Look for the devil's marks upon him. Right. Help it, you two.
Hounding the innocent in violence and terror, this evil man showed no mercy in the pursuit and interrogation of his victims. He was called the Witchfinder General. And amidst the horror of the witch hunt, a story of tender young love.
Didn't your uncle just say you must early to bed?
He did.
And isn't he a wise man?
He is.
But even their innocence is cruelly corrupted by the vile touch of the Witchfinder General.
My motive in coming here was to find the truth.
Vincent Price is the Witchfinder General. Lust and greed were his only gods.
The money from the magistrate. 9 guineas in silver.
Good. Now we can leave.
Okay, so Witchfinder General, in which Vincent Price arrives much later than I remembered originally. It's like, am I watching the right film? It's a fairly straightforward plot. We've got the world of, as you said, the English Civil War. We've got the world of the witch hunts in Britain.
Yes.
And we've got Vincent Price, who's going around generally taking advantage of the whole situation and robbing and whoring, but through the guise of doing a service to these villages. That I'll come kill your witches if you pay me some silver guineas. Yeah. Which looked very heavy. Nine silver guineas apparently takes up an entire satchel.
Yeah, it's a lot. Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, so it's a fairly, I mean, the plot is actually not that complex, and it's quite melodramatic, really, and it almost reminded me of an opera or something, because you don't have a lot of characters.
Yeah,
you've got this, you get this establish of a seemingly happy young couple.
Yeah.
Little rumblings of bad political things going on. The young man's a soldier. She lives with her uncle, who's a priest. And it isn't until Vincent Price comes on the scene as the Witchfinder, because the priest, none other than the priest, has been accused of witchcraft.
Yeah.
And it's very clear to the audience from the beginning that the motives for these accusations are purely political.
Yeah.
He's accused of being a papist, that there's been graffiti on his church, there's all these kind of things. So that when the Witchfinder General comes in, or at this point, he's still just the Witchfinder. He's not yet been promoted. That's later in the film. But yeah, when he comes in, there's no question on the audience part as to whether or not this guy is a witch. We believe him to be a priest. We believe him to be good.
Yeah.
We believe these accusations to be strictly because the people are trying to oust him as a papist.
Yes.
That they want control of what he has, and they want him gone as a result.
Yes.
So it's really interesting to think of this as a horror film in that sense, because there is no supernatural.
No.
And we're told straight from the beginning that there is no supernatural.
Yeah.
So as things move on, this priest, the only person who wants to come to his aid is his niece, who is our heroine, married to our hero, who's the soldier off at war, who does seemingly the done thing, which is make eyes at Vincent Price and agree to tell him everything she knows, which is code for give up the goods in exchange for her uncle's life.
Yeah.
Which I'm not gonna go into the rest in detail, but it doesn't go well.
It doesn't go well for
It
anyone
doesn't go well at
involved.
all.
It's a really bleak film.
Vincent
actually.
does not keep his word.
Vincent does not keep his word, and the whole film is quite relentless, and it's quite. I think it's because it's interesting because, like you say, it's in some ways it barely even feels like a horror movie, but in other ways it's a relentless watch actually, and it's quite a hard watch, I think.
And a lot of that comes from, I suppose I should go a bit further. What comes next, which is the torture.
Yes.
Because Vincent, it's not just for Vincent to come into town and say, yes, she's a witch, now I'm going to kill her, it's done. He has to get them to confess.
Yeah.
And this will come up again actually in Blood on Satan's Claw, the tests,
yes.
and also the moralness of it, because in this one we've got the Witchfinder, who is a bad guy, absolutely a bad guy. We've never had any doubt, but actually when you get to Blood on Satan's Claw, the Witchfinder in that film is actually a good guy. He's actually the hero of the film.
Yeah.
So again, we've got this completely different two sides of the coin.
It's
here.
really interesting, the ideology, how they're different, the two films, because the Blood on Satan's Claw is basically saying, look, the devil exists and therefore God is good, and Christianity is good.
Exactly.
I suppose.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, I think this film in some ways is even more daring and progressive for its time, because Witchfinder General is basically saying, look how fucking awful this is, where religion
challenging
gets you.
Christianity, exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what very much reminds me of The Devils in that sense, is
Yeah,
that it's definitely questioning that authority. It's definitely questioning those more. It's certainly asserting that just because you're Christian doesn't mean you're in the moral good.
You're good. Yeah, exactly.
But the other guy, of course, is Vincent Price's grim sidekick, who is his torturer,
who is really a proper sadist.
Oh my god, he's so grim, and I feel like they managed to find a way to just constantly film him, so he constantly has like spittle and beer pouring down the front of his beard.
He's monstrous. He's a proper monster.
He's always moist in the face, moist of face. It's really grim. And they've given him as well this really visceral weapon, which is this sort of pricker, which is it's like a 6-inch penknife,
which was a real thing that that
Damn.
they used to do to test for witches. So all of this is what's really interesting about this film, because apparently it's not based on a true story, obviously, but it kind of is. Matthew Hopkins was a real guy who was really the Witchfinder General and genuinely did this, appointed himself Witchfinder General, was basically an opportunist and took advantage of what was going on in the country at this point and would march in and basically get paid to test for witches and burn witches.
What a dick.
And what a dick. And use these methods, like you say, but prick them, and if they bleed, they're not a witch, and if they are, or whatever it is, if they don't bleed, they're a witch.
It's so specific and yet so obviously wrong. Where they have the specific thing that if you've got the mark of a devil and it's a place on your body that if it's pricked with a pin, you will feel no pain and you will not bleed. And it's like, we're going to perforate the hell out of you until we can find
this mark.
And if we don't, I'm very sorry, but you're bleeding to death anyway. Yeah. But everyone knows the water test because everyone's seen Monty Python.
Yeah, you can't not think of Monty Python.
But the idea that, and the thing that was added, not added maybe, but more historically accurate, obviously, than Monty Python in the Witchfinder General, which obviously I'm American, so I got most of my British history from Monty Python. Yeah, so of course, that's how I know you guys were occupied by France and the Knights who say knee. But
there are ways of telling whether she is a witch.
What are they telling us?
Tell me, what do you do with witches? And what do you burn apart from witches?
More witches!
Wood! So, why do witches burn?
Because they're made of wood.
Good!
Something I hadn't really ever caught before is the idea that you were tied up in a certain way before you were thrown in the water.
Yes.
And so, because I don't know, I don't know if you do this, but whenever I watch a film where somebody's like might drown, I have a tendency to hold my breath for as long as they have to.
Yeah.
And the thing that always bugged me is like, well, just hold your breath, let yourself sink like a rock to the bottom of the lake, and then when they're satisfied you're not floating, come back up.
Yeah.
But okay, so I've realized why that won't work now. You're basically trussed up like a Christmas chicken.
Yeah.
Chicken, goose, what are those? Christmas fowl.
Yeah.
And you literally, you struggle, you drown, you're done.
Yeah,
there's no way, you're not swimming back to the top because you can't, because you're tied up.
And there's that horrible moment when he dunks those three, and then two of them,
only two come back.
Yeah, if you float, you're a witch. If you don't float, you're innocent. But then you're dead. And there's that moment when one of them just drowns, and Vincent Price goes, "She was innocent." It's like, oh, great,
She was innocent.
God forgive you, Matthew Hopkins.
Jailer! Take them to the tree.
What are your thoughts in general of the kind of the treatment of women in this movie? Obviously that she gets raped, doesn't she? The vicar's niece.
Yeah. I don't think it's problematic in context.
Yes.
I think if one were to make a super cut of this movie and play it on loop, that would be problematic behavior. Yeah. But it's history. As you say, there was a lot of research put into this film, and a lot of it is historically accurate. And as we are well aware at this point in history, women have gotten the short end of the stick for quite some time.
Quite a long time, yeah.
And I'd say too, I think in both films, there's rape scenes in both films. And and I think both are handled brilliantly. I think they're cinematic. I think they cut away in the right places. I think they hold in the right places.
I think so.
They don't fetishize the moments.
No,
they portray the moments.
There's nothing titillating about Witchfinder General.
Oh my god!
At all.
And it's also. I'm trying. Oh gosh, no, it cuts wide, doesn't it? Because it's not Vincent Price who rapes her.
No, it's because he has to leave town. And then his assistant
takes over his duties.
And then Vincent Price comes back and discovers this and then decides, oh, you are, she's damaged goods now.
It's not worth having her anymore.
Yeah.
If my disgusting torturer's apprentice has had her, I don't want anything to do with it. You get the sense that they don't share fries at dinner. That they're sort of not very much not a lot of chemistry between Vincent and his assistant there. But yeah, it's shot through a fence in a wide. You get the initial aggression of it, and then you get someone watching it. And actually, the worst bit I think is actually that the person who observes it sort of sneers and doesn't stop. That they all almost accept it and approve of it. But we're given the sense that they're a terrible person for it. It's never, nobody's vindicated. Nobody's, the punishments are doled out considerably. But
yeah, and I think that's where the kind of the folky element comes in as well, because I think, you know, folk obviously also has that kind of inherent fear of the old and the old ways, and this is like, you know, really telling us what used to happen in old England and all of these horrific things, and the town and the people around them just let it happen.
Well, sexuality...
They all watch women burn, and they all watch people get raped or taken advantage of or whatever, and it's that feeling of a trap, like there's no escape, you know.
And there's a really horrific burning in the middle of Witchfinder General.
Like really unflinching, isn't it?
And you there's a sort of there's no score to it. It's just and really the sound design is this woman screaming, and I think the thing that's especially troubling about it is she's screaming pretty constantly before they even put her to the fire.
Yes. And you're like, oh God, how long is this gonna?
It just gets, and there's a desperation to it,
yes.
and a sort of finality to it that is just, just absolutely curdling. But one of the things I noticed about it as well, though, is that the audience of people, the village people who have gathered to watch this horrific murder, There are a few who seem on board with it, to be enjoying a nice day out at the public execution. But then there's a lot of the little kids actually have their eyes closed, or their hands over their eyes even. Yeah. And there's a lot of sad, shocked faces. And I sort of, the village as a whole isn't being indicted. They don't seem to have any power in this either.
True.
That if they said stop, don't do it, it doesn't feel as though they could
be a witch.
Exactly. Then suddenly they're a witch as well.
Yeah.
And if you look back to something like The Crucible, and that mass hysteria and paranoia is very much a part of that.
I think that's what, because the opening scene, isn't it, is this woman kind of being dragged to the gallows, and then she's hanged. And again, there's this whole group of people, and to begin with, they're all a bit kind of, village kind of, lynch mob. And then they all sort of watch it happen, and then there's this just kind of quiet when she's dead, and then they all just kind of slowly disperse. And it's kind of a bit, again, it's kind of grim, and it feels a bit like this is just an everyday thing that happens in all of these little towns.
You do almost expect that sort of like Royston Vasey or Monty Python sort of, is that it? Bit anticlimactic.
Yeah, totally. And that is what it feels like. And again, it's that bleakness. The film is just bleak, you know?
And in this way, I wonder if there isn't something intrinsically British about folk horror.
Yeah.
And there's something about that, twitching curtains and the secret below. Exactly, the secret below, and we're all staying quiet for the status quo, but we all know what's going on.
Yeah.
Like there's a lot of that about, and I think, again, for me, that to me is what I think of when I think of a folk horror film.
Yeah.
Hallelujah! Salvation, glory and power is to our God.
Way back on the very first episode of this podcast, I spoke to Kim Newman, who was trying to describe what horror was, really, and he gave a very simple but effective description that it tends to be that normality is threatened by the monster, and that's something that you could, I think, apply to most horror genre movies out there. But he did himself say, actually, there are quite a lot of exceptions to that. You perversely start thinking of examples where normality is the monster, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, for example. And actually, thinking about it, I think that is a huge fundamental aspect of folk horror for me. As we said, the horrors, the violence, they tend to be portrayed as kind of almost everyday things. These are rituals and traditions that people live by and believe in. So actually, this goes hand in hand with what we were just saying about Witchfinder General, and how there's something about these horrible kind of violent moments that seem very everyday, and that makes them all the more bleak and disturbing. The way that these villagers are all kind of, unintentionally complicit and watch all these horrible things happen. And again, the feeling that these characters are trapped. There's no one who they can turn to. There's no one who can save them. A big theme going through all of the folk horrors that we're going to be covering. So again, I think folk horror, a big part of it is the flip side to normality is threatened by the monster. I think folk horror tends to be normality is the monster. and you know what, it works for a lot of reasons, because this was a horrible period of history, and it was horrible people doing horrible things, and the film is horrible, and it's unflinching and relentless, and it's like, well, it kind of, and like you said, there's no music or anything, and it's like you really feel like there's an authenticity to it. I think
there's a
isn't
reality.
There?
Well,
Yeah.
and again, I think there's a lot of using consistent screams and please as sound design.
It's like an early torture porn, isn't it? In a lot of ways,
it is, and it is, and at the same time, it doesn't escalate in the same way I would say that torture porn does, because
it's
it's
not
just
porny and torture porny.
Exactly. Yeah, it lacks the sort of drooling element.
Yeah, exactly.
The titillation element.
Yeah.
But it's even when the priest is first put in the jail, he's taken past a couple of other cells, and you hear women crying, and you don't see them until they get drowned later.
Yeah.
But the first, you don't see them until a couple scenes later, but their crying is the only thing you hear.
Yeah.
And these pleas of please help me, please don't kill me, all this kind of stuff. And I love as well, they when he's initially and I say approached, but he's initially set upon by the Witchfinder, I suppose.
Yeah.
He starts praying, the priest starts praying in Latin, and the priest says, even now he prays to his dark. Exactly. Yeah. It's like, do you guys even have you ever been to church? Like, do you know that's okay.
I know.
But yeah, just all of this kind of stuff is the backgrounds for the sound design. And when you get into the sort of final moments of the film, which are another horrific torture sequence. Yeah. And again, it's just this damn penknife being relentlessly driven into people over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And it's, it's relentless. And the only sounds to accompany it is the pleading and begging for it to stop.
Yeah.
It's incredible. It's absolutely impactful and so simple, but just so visceral as well.
It is. And the way, like you say, it just goes on in the background of some scenes, again, giving it that kind of like everyday feeling, almost just like it's like a non-event almost. Exactly. That this stuff is going on, which makes it all the more horrific. And it's so bleak and nihilistic. And the end,
nihilistic's a good word for it.
It is nihilistic, and the way that it ends with, the soldier wanting to take his revenge, and he's chopping up on the Witchfinder with an axe, and then that guy comes in to save him and shoots him, and even that is like, you took him from me.
You took him from me. You took him from me. You took him from me. May God have mercy on us all.
Well, it's very revengey.
Yes.
Like it's definitely worth, like, revenge is the thing driving the narrative of this film forward. If it weren't for the fact that that they had raped his wife, then very likely the film would just stop after the first act. Yes. So there is this very sort of classic theme of what I do like, though, is that the husband doesn't discard his wife because she was raped.
Yeah, I had a horrible feeling that was going to happen when he returned and found out.
He's unlike Vincent Price.
He's a good gentleman.
He's cool with that. He knows this, he's asking all the right questions. But yeah, so that was good and fairly modern of the film, I thought, because I think historically that probably wouldn't have happened.
No.
For all of its historical accuracies, I appreciate that it was at least humanistic and modern in that sense.
I think, like, for a film as horrific as this is in a lot of ways, it feels like its heart is kind of in the right place in a weird way, doesn't it? Which is what's really interesting about it. And I think it's aged quite well in that regard. It's 50 years old.
Is it 50 years old?
Yeah,
and that's
exactly 50 years old.
I'll be honest, it looks great.
It really does.
It looks great. It's performed very well. I think it holds up brilliantly. I think it's obviously a classic film.
Yeah.
But no, I think it's still as viable a watch. Could still generate people writing papers about it.
Totally.
Everything. I think it's still absolutely.
I mean, what do you think of Vincent Price in this, quickly? Because, again, we talked about him before in the William Castle movies, these kind of campy ghost movies. And he was always this kind of fun, campy character, really, Vincent Price. And you can imagine, like, in 1968, the big British horror films at this time were Hammer films. And it's like there's a new British horror film with Vincent Price. People were probably expecting it to be not as nihilistic as this, bleak. I imagine.
Well, and I do think that's one of the reasons it makes such an impact is because you keep expecting there to be some kind of light relief, and there isn't.
Yeah.
And you know, when the niece is sort of suggesting to Vincent, and I love that scene as well, because it's basically it's very much like someone's been pulled over for a speeding ticket and they're trying to offer the cop a bribe, but they don't want to be done for offering the cop a bribe.
Exactly.
She's like, so if is there, can we come
go
to
over
an
that tonight? Yeah.
That, and she's very coy about it, and you expect Price to show up and be there ready to grill her. I mean, ask her questions. You expect him to show up and for the miscommunication to be that she expected sex, and really he's just going to ask her all these questions. But he just shows up and undresses her.
Yeah,
and it's like, oh, Vincent, this is not
straight to
this
it.
is
This is not the Vincent Price that we know.
Exactly.
That's the thing. He always had this air of like he's got a twinkle in his eye, Vincent Price. But actually, with this movie, I think he does a good job of playing it pretty straight and pretty evil.
He's vicious. He's absolutely vicious. And there's a terrific beat when he hears that she's been raped, where you just see in his face he's done. Yeah, and it's you gotta love a bit of face acting.
He does well, because actually famously he didn't get on with the director. The director didn't want him. He wasn't his first choice. Originally, the director wanted to cast Donald Pleasance in that role, and then was pressured to cast Vincent Price. You think that'd be great to get someone at the time as big as Vincent Price. But
exactly.
Again, I think he thought Vincent Price was not right for the tone of a film like this. And apparently the constant arguments they kept having was that the director kept saying, tone it down, you know, less is more kind of thing.
Do you know who I am?
Yeah. How dare
I'm
you?
Vincent Price.
Yeah. So it is interesting, but I think he does do a good job of toning it down, personally.
I think it's brilliantly underplayed.
Yeah.
And it could, like, I understand where the director is coming from in that sense. Like, you can see how if this was played for laughs or if it was played camp, then it would have serious issues tonally,
yes,
or be at odds with some of the narrative. But gosh, no. And can I just give some applause for that poster paint red blood?
Oh yeah. yes.
Which,
that's where the hammer element comes in, isn't it? Yeah.
I love that stuff, and it's obviously it's not real in any way, but I absolutely adore it. There's something so, and I don't know if it's nostalgia or if it's actually a visceral response I'm having, but
I'm sure it's a bit of both, isn't it?
It's so
definitely.
good.
It is
good. I love it. I don't know why. I wish we had more of it.
No, it works. Although weirdly, it is the one element that doesn't look authentic in the film, but it works. It works well.
It really does. It really does. Just those pinpricks of blood appearing.
It's nice to have a splash of proper red in amongst all those kind of very sort of greeny,
the earthy browns,
earthy colours.
No, it does. It brings some vibrance to it.
Michael Reeves, the director, and he died only like a year later after making the film. Sadly.
Really?
So he never made another film, and actually, I think the film, the popularity at the time grew sort of slowly. So I don't think he ever sort of came to realise how successful or popular the film became, or his influence in starting this made-up subgenre known as folk
subgenre
horror.
We've all decided exists, that we're all a part of. We can all do it together.
Exactly. So for people who haven't, I mean, hopefully if you're listening to this, you've seen it because we've gone into detail there. But would you recommend this to horror fans?
Oh,
still?
for sure. And I think too, it's almost the kind of film I'd say, like, if you've got parents who are a hard sell on horror films, but like old classic movies or historical films or that kind of thing, it's a bit of a crossover movie.
It is.
Because it's not just a horror film. There's so many other layers to it. And you know, as I say, it's not just a horror film. Some people will quite easily argue it's not a horror film. So I think absolutely it's definitely worth the watch. And you know, I think it would be interesting for people to make up their own minds whether or not they think it is a folk horror or not.
Yes, either a horror or even a folk horror or even a horror. Like
exactly.
you say, it's a weird one. Yeah. All right, let's move on to something I think is definitely a lot more horror and more folk horror as well.
Yeah, definite on both counts.
Yeah. So Blood on Satan's Claw.
So my favorite thing about this movie, and it will always be my favorite thing about this movie, is Linda Hayden as Angel Blake.
She's brilliant.
With these amazing charcoal eyebrows.
I knew you were going to talk about the eyebrows.
Her mad blonde hair and these just sort of beautiful floral wreaths. It's so very in right now.
Oh, it's so in. Yeah.
She looks straight out of Coachella 2016.
She does.
It's brilliant.
She does.
It's really brilliant. Like,
and we've talked about this already, but this does feel like a response to the hippie movement and
it really does.
fear of young people. And
it
that
very,
kind of
very
thing,
much.
doesn't
Well,
it?
and sexual power
Sexual
and
power.
adolescence, and I think one of the themes, obviously we talked about the sexual abuse in Witchfinder General, but I do think that sort of fertility and sexual power and man-womanness is another thing about these folk horror films. When you talk about, you can just imagine like fertile statues and sort of fruit. It's the whole Summer Isle thing is fertility, isn't it?
Yeah,
like,
absolutely. Yeah.
But yeah, I think, and even the weird naked people at the end of Kill List, like it's all sort
totally.
of. I think. Just weird sexual
it's an interesting
references
one,
or underpinnings. Yeah.
Absolutely, because like when we talked about The Innocents and The Haunting, where there was a lot of kind of repressed sexual stuff in those types of horror movies. With this, it's like they bear all, and it's like a weird mix of kind of. Obviously, it's like a 70s movie. It's going to be a little bit probably titillating at times as well. There's a lot of naked frolicking in woods and stuff like that. But also there's a kind of, as well as just being sexual, it's kind of earthiness to it or something, isn't there? Again, this kind of like back to basics type of feel to it.
Very much so. Very, very sort of, again, like very Burning Man, very Coachella, very sort of like...
Yeah, exactly.
That's going to be that'll be my modern folk horror, is it'll be Burning Man gone wrong.
Exactly. I love it. That's a good idea. So let me quickly do the story of
Go for
Blood
it,
on
yeah.
Satan's Claw. So this is, again, it's set, I don't think it's ever exactly specified when it's set, but I think it's a similar sort of time. It's sort of 17th
I think it's definitely
century
Civil
England.
War-ish. Yeah.
And we start off with a man sort of ploughing a crop field, and he comes across like a skull, or what he calls a fiend, the remains of a fiend, an evil fiend. And basically they uncover some sort of weird demon thing that then infects this whole town essentially, and it starts to affect all of the young people mostly, and they all become these kind of weird Satan worshipping types. They grow kind of weird bits of furry skin on them, or so one of them grows a kind of claw for a hand, and they're all kind of doing, look, I mean, it is basically, I think they do basically say it's Satan, don't they? And it's kind of, they're all doing Satan's bidding. Yeah. And it's almost like this Satan creature is kind of rebuilding itself from bits of the townfolk. Yeah.
Like I like it though, in that it's the narrative is really underexplained in this film.
Very underexplained.
And it's almost irrelevant, really.
Yeah.
Like you're watching it, like the actual impetus of the narrative is the main is Angel, like taking over the children and convincing the children in this sort of mass hysteria to murder their comrades and all this kind of stuff. And the drive of that narrative is this weird devil homunculus that's never properly explained or really resolved.
No.
And it's there and it's clear, and we'll probably almost definitely talk about that some more, because when it gets very clear, it's mildly problematic. But it's we never answer any of the questions like, did he cause this?
No.
Why is it there? Would it have come out anyway if he just well enough alone? It's just happening to them.
Yes.
And you get a sense that it would be happening to them whether or not they sinned, whether or not they did what they were supposed to do, to priests, to children, to adults. It happens to everybody.
Yeah, exactly. It feels like that's how it kind of feels like a bit of an old folk tale almost itself. It's just like they've uncovered from the earth some demon that's risen up, and that's it. There was nothing that anyone could do, sort of thing.
And you know what? Again, you do get in the Angel Blake character this sort of willing to take advantage of the circumstances, because she's not gifted with any more power than anyone else.
No.
She just takes the reins.
Yes.
So very much like Vincent Price's character, she's taking advantage of the situation and is therefore the sort of the leader of the hysterical.
Yeah, and like if you drew the kind of real life comparisons, you see, it feels like with these kids, she is the popular pretty one, she probably is the ringleader of that class of kids.
Well,
you know,
she's the one having sex.
yeah,
it's like
exactly.
there's very much all the boys like her
exactly
because she's
sexually
having
active
sex with
one.
them.
Yeah,
and there's a bit later where two young girls are trying to convince another young boy to come out and play with them, which he really shouldn't do because it's not going to end well for him. And they say, Angel's been teaching us new games.
Yeah.
And there's no bones about it. They mean doing it.
Oh, 100%.
It's on the table.
But that's it, yeah. You could strip away the Satan element, and it is basically like these kids are all, you know, it's just about teenagers.
They've all figured out sex, and it's driving them mad.
Exactly, that's basically it, isn't it? And it's like an adult fear of teenagers. That's what it feels like.
And there's the sexuality of children, and there's there's a scene as well. Again, you've got the priest. In this one, he's a bit more of a... Well, we talked about the fact that it's really 3 stories woven into one.
Yes, we should mention that. So originally, this was supposed to be a kind of portmanteau anthology type film, wasn't it? And it was going to be 3 stories, all kind of set in the same place and with similar crossovers, but 3 separate stories. And then they've kind of merged them into one. I think the main story of Angel Blake and these kids is the one that they've made the whole film about. But there are elements, I think, of the other 2 stories still within this. So
the young wealthy lover who's partner, and she's the one who totally disappears from the story.
Exactly. I think that was going to be another story, the kind of arm in the attic that comes out from the floorboard and all of that kind of thing.
Then you get the brother and sister who were killed by Angel's crew, and then you get the guy who originally found it.
Yes, exactly.
And his sort of coming to the end in the ultimate showdown.
Yes. Again, kind of Devils-esque, that sort of weird orgy type scene.
Everybody, there's another fantastic film called, I think it's just called Witches, it's just called Witches.
Witches.
I think it's set maybe late 30s, early 40s, and a woman goes to go teach in a countryside town, and it's they've got a whole witches make you horny kind of scene in a falling down ruin, and I like there's that element of the faux horror as well. Like, can you have a faux horror without a bunch of like free hanging boobs?
I know.
And some ruins in the backgrounds. Like, exactly. is that part of fire? We need fire.
Fire, exactly. Yeah, exactly. All of those kind of earthy, and again, the way
sounds
this
like a part again. Burning Man 2016.
Burning Man 2016. It's sort of like... 100%. What were we saying? You were going to say something about the vicar character.
Oh yeah. So he, we talk about the church, and in the Witchfinder General, we do very much see that the church is scrutinized, and even though the priest is not a bad guy, we still doubt the church's position and their morals and da. But in this, the priest, I mean, he's not a fun dude, but he's definitely on the straight and narrow.
Yes, he's a good man.
Exactly. And so when he is accused of assault by the Angel Blake character, he's taken away as a devil, and it, bless it, all boils down to the fact that he had a pet bunny.
Yes.
And because obviously bunnies are signs of fertility, they assumed that was his familiar, and it all went downhill. So it's all the bunny's fault, really.
Poor bunny, yeah.
But it's this sexuality. She does, the angel character does come to the priest in the church and undress herself in front of him, and he is horrified as any good adult would be.
Yeah.
And he's definitely got all over his face, I need an adult, like the stranger danger, somebody help me. And she knows exactly what she's doing, and it's very much this fear of a young person's sexual power.
Totally, it's a weird one now, but looking through a sort of modern lens of it flipped this way round in a way of like, oh, she's the troublesome, promiscuous teenage girl who's tempting the Catholic priest.
Exactly.
And the Catholic priest is totally innocent in the whole
Everything's
thing.
context, isn't
it? Yes, exactly. But
I think the thing that to a modern audience is most shocking about it is just how young she is. How young Linda Hayden is. I think she's 17 at the time.
God, and she gets proper full frontal naked.
It's all out there. Yeah. And there's a slightly uncomfortable bit in the commentary where she's looking at that scene, and she says that she's got a daughter about that age. Ooh. And so she just sees her daughter when she sees. And the thing is, she's not a woman. This is not a woman you're looking at. This is very clearly a teenage girl.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the discomfort comes from.
Yeah.
And they managed to straddle it really effectively. phrasing. But it's that they don't. Again, it's not titillating. It's dangerous.
It's not. It is. Yeah, totally.
There's a real danger to this, and it's not put there for us to ogle at it. And even, I mean, let's get into it. The horrific rape scene.
Yeah, we
later.
need to talk about the rape scene. I mean, this is what it's quite famous set piece now right in the middle of this film, isn't it?
I think it is both horrific and also brilliantly done, and again, totally appropriate and totally well handled.
Yeah.
There's virtually no nudity in it, which is there's a sort of brief flash of nudity in this moment, but otherwise it's about the people who are looking on and their expressions.
Yes, it's a lot of the oglers, isn't it?
And these two old people who, again, like old people in sex folk horror.
Terrifying.
Like, it's all about the old people in sex.
It is. That's weird, isn't it? How there were just two old people at the back.
It's kind of this idea of like the disenfranchised all coming together and taking the power away from the people who had it.
Yeah.
And these two mad old people who have long since lost their dentures.
It's so funny. Again, it's like nightmarish versions of old people,
So
isn't it? Kind of cackling with saggy skin and no teeth.
Yeah. Their skincare regimes have gone right out the window. There is no self-care going on there. But it's phenomenally well filmed, and I think it's I'm gonna regret saying this down the road, but there's almost a beautiful element to the way it's filmed in
There is.
As this horrible assault is going on and this guy's writhing on top of this young girl, there are these branches, these sort of, I don't know if they're willow or dogwood or something, but they've got these little white blossoms on them.
Yeah.
And they're on the back of the guy, and so you get this sort of undulation of these branches is what you see. So the movement is really heavily implied, and it's harrowing, but you're seeing it through the movement of these white flowers, which are obviously it's sort of like visually purity and this kind of. So it's just a phenomenally well done scene, and the young actress, whose name I don't know, I'm afraid, but the young actress who suffers all the way through it. Oh, God, she's brilliant. Her like, she plays fearful in a spectacular way.
She's brilliant, isn't she? Yeah, let me see if I can find her name.
She cannot believe what's going on. It's brilliant.
Kathy Vespers? Is that the character's name?
It's a great name.
Wendy Pedbury, who actually I believe was she was a Doctor Who companion back
there
then
you go.
as well. Yeah, and she was thrilled to be doing something a bit more adult and gritty. And getting
well,
raped.
It certainly was.
Yes.
And it's and you know, I'll say too, it sounds from the director's commentaries and the actors' commentaries, it sounds like both scenes were filmed very respectfully and responsibly.
Yes.
And it's a shame, really, because I think it's a powerful device when you put a rape in a film, and I think it's sort of been taken out of the hands of modern filmmakers because it did get used excessively, and it has been used excessively to a point that it's not effective.
I think it just needs to be justified, doesn't it?
It really
it's like,
does.
Why are you I think, sometimes filmmakers just need to ask themselves, why am I putting a gratuitous rape scene in this? Is it necessary?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's and you look back at these films in this era in particular, and it wasn't common because the censors wouldn't let it through. So you had to be able to justify it. Yeah. They had to sit down with the BBFC and go through that scene and justify it. And apparently the conversation they had at the time was you can have sex and you can have violence, but violent sex is problematic.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm very much anti-censorship and all of that, but I'm also very pro good filmmaking, and I think that there's a lot of people who I wouldn't be very bothered if they were censored because they weren't using it very skillfully. But gosh, when you look at films like this and you just watch that scene and you see so very little and you feel so very much.
Yeah, it's really clever, and the way again it links back to that whole idea of like the Witchfinder, where you've got all of these onlookers and no one's helping, and that feeling of being entrapped with and amongst the whole community. And like you say, there's loads of shots of just people watching it, and there's a couple of shots of people, including the old people, who are getting more and more excited. It's almost like they're all having sex.
It's frenzy, isn't it?
Or almost like they're all getting off on it, and they're
definitely all
getting
getting
off, and they're all
off
like
on
building towards some sort of climax together. It feels like as a group,
very much.
aren't
It's
they?
very this sort of like ecstasy.
Yeah.
Like there's an ecstasy that's building. And again, that's a fantastic contrast to that scene we were talking about in Witchfinder General when the woman's being burned alive.
Yes.
Where you've got the crowd around them who are still not doing anything to help, but are
just
completely detached.
Yes, exactly.
So again, it's really interesting the way that the films reflect each other.
Yeah.
So there's definitely something, going back to our core definition, there's definitely something about a disconnect from society, or the power of a crowd, or the lack of power of a crowd, or the power of a crowd to the power of the individual. There's definitely something there.
The group psychosis.
Mass hysteria.
Mass hysteria. It tends to be that there's not one antagonist, like there is a slasher or a ghost. It tends to be a group, a community,
and it's sort of, if you cut off the head of the beast, you can kill the rest of it. Like there's usually that figurehead. If you remove them, the rest of it will fall. But you can't just you can't just kill anyone. You've got to kill the figurehead.
Exactly. And it's like you're saying, that the way that it's shot kind of through the kind of blossom and trees, there's so much of that. We should talk about the cinematography, because it is amazing in this film, actually. And there are so many shots. I've heard Piers Haggard talk about it, the director, and how he wanted lots of kind of very low angles where you get the soil in the foreground.
The nooks and crannies of woodland, the edges of fields, the ploughing. The labour, the sense of the soil was something that I tried to bring into the picture.
And it's interesting because, we talked about this earlier, but, obviously Witchfinder General came first. But even so, it feels like this was the first proper folk horror movie, but because of those connections and because of the fact that they drew on Witchfinder General, you can't not call Witchfinder General a folk horror, I suppose. But it's kind of more of a proto-folk horror, really. And this was actually the first movie on record that was labelled a folk horror. Piers Haggard used the term in a Fangoria interview in 2003. He described the film as folk horror. But actually, according to Kevin Lyons, he's a writer and the editor of the site EOFFTV, the Encyclopedia of Fantastic Film and Television, and on there it's a great resource, actually. There's loads and loads of interesting reviews and facts about a lot of these kind of strange, lesser-known folk horrors. But he actually mentions in his review for Blood on Satan's Claw that there was a report that was done in the film in Keen Weekly from reporter Rod Cooper, who filed the report under the headline Folk Horror Study from Hemdale and Chiltern. And Kevin argues that is the earliest account. That's the earliest evidence of somebody using the term folk horror in relation to a film. And it was Blood on Satan's Claw. So I think that cinematography, those shots that Piers Haggard was coming up with there, that emphasis on the soil and the earth and the landscape, I think he was kind of creating the language of folk horror, really, with Blood on Satan's Claw.
So in the opening scene where, the lonely ploughman and his girl across the valley, and you gradually become aware something is going to happen, but you don't know what it is.
In the foreground, you've got trees, or, again, blossom sometimes, or sort of silhouettes of branches kind of almost framing the foreground, and then other stuff happening in the background.
It's these really beautiful frames, and they remind me of those sort of like Victorian watercolors where it's just a sort of like a scene that a lady might paint on a canvas in the middle of a park, kind of. And they're these beautiful pastoral images. Where then this horrible violence is just underneath. And I think, again, that's one of these inherent elements, isn't it? That there's this beautiful place that something horrible is happening.
And again, it's like most of the horrific stuff happens in broad daylight. It couldn't be in some ways less horror-y. You haven't got dark and stormy nights, shadowy corridors, creaky houses. Really, it's none of that. It's quite luscious almost, isn't it, really, the whole setting?
Well, exactly. And I think probably the two most horrific scenes in the whole film are if they were cut differently or sound designed differently, could be quite jolly. It's when the brother and the sister are individually let out to their horrible fates.
Yes.
And, we talked about the little boys coaxed out because these two girls are promising they'll get it on with him. And then, he goes out in the woods and horrible things happen. But there's sort of a game of... what do you guys call it? Where you put you've got a different word for it than we do in the States. No, I can't remember either of them.
Where you put like the thing on someone's head and do
and they spin them around, and then they have to blind man's bluff.
Blind man's bluff.
Yeah, there you go. So he thinks he's playing a game when in fact it's this horrible violence is about to befall him. And then the little girl, these boys hunt her. I mean, they absolutely. They lie in wait, they watch her, they approach her quietly, they trick her into following. It just, it reminds me of those horrible stories where children would take other children out in the woods and kill them.
Yes, it is exactly like that. Like the Slender Man, which in some ways is folk horror, like kind of modern folk horror.
Exactly, yeah. And it's just this unthinkable violence and unthinkable evil that it surely it cannot be human. It's so unthinkable.
And again, it's like these kind of nightmarish stereotypes of teenagers. You've got the boys in this film are either really dumb and or they're like proper sexual animalistic predators that kind of grab, literally there's that horrible bit when they tie Kathy in the rope and kind of pull her around. And then the girls are kind of using their sexuality to manipulate men or, lie or deceive. It's like these kind of classic kind of cliche stereotypes of teenage genders or something.
It really is. And it's very cat and mousey. Like there's a playfulness where they're playing with you for a bit before they kill you, and they know it.
Yes, they take so much joy in it, don't they?
Exactly. There's a real sadism to it. There's a real sadism to it. And again, that's something that was definitely present in the Witchfinder General. The torturer is getting pleasure from the torture. There's a very clear link there. And these aren't things that are glamorized or aggrandized, and they're definitely things the villains are doing, but they're just harrowing.
It's weird. Blood on Satan's Claw walks a really fine line, doesn't it? Because we talked about how it is kind of luscious and it's beautiful, and it is kind of in a weird way much more enjoyable to watch than Witchfinder General.
I definitely enjoy it more.
Yeah, it's one that I'm much more compelled to go back and revisit. I think
it's a lot. After just having described terrific rape scenes, it's a lot more fun.
Exactly, that's the thing, isn't it?
But
that's
it is
how
more
really
fun.
treads a really brilliant fine line, because it never does feel exploitative or problematic in that way either, despite the fact that it is very lovely to watch for a lot of
exactly.
it.
And it is, and again, I think maybe that's that sort of juxtaposition to show us something really beautiful and then show us something really horrible. It takes you on a journey. So it makes the beautiful more beautiful and the ugly more ugly, I suppose.
And it is it's a proper kind of ensemble piece, isn't it, as opposed to Witchfinder General, which is very much Vincent Price's movie. It feels like this is real kind of, again, maybe it comes from the fact that it was originally 3 stories, but it feels very much spread across this whole town.
And weirdly, you're absolutely right, and it's strange almost that the angel character feels like she is the antagonist of the film, because she's not really got that much more screen time than anyone else, but she is so impactful that almost the charisma that she's using to lead all these kids on a wayward path, it's almost infectious towards the audience as well, where it really pulls you in and really engages you. You want to see what she's doing next. You want to know what she's got going on.
She's brilliant. She's got, like you say, she's got so much charisma, and the way that they shoot her sometimes, the way that the extreme close-ups on her face when she looks down the lens with these kind of devilish
amazing eyes.
So good.
And locations are spectacular in all of these films, like just these old ruins. There's a lot of it though. I mean, Britain's a really lucky country to have all this stuff. Because it's these beautiful places. And it was funny in Witchfinder General, I did have a lot of instances where I felt like they'd just thrown a load of straw onto the tarmac in front of the pub and changed the sign. And moved the cars round back. Because I feel like you see those British pubs everywhere. They are the same. 100%. And then similarly with the ruins, I've shot in some of these old buildings and they look exactly the same as they did in the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, it's incredible.
I mean, they're 1,000 years old, some of these buildings. So obviously they're not very different to where they were a couple hundred years ago or 50 years ago.
No, and that's what works so well. Like you said, there is I think it was Rhys Shearsmith. I was listening to the commentary and the League of Gentlemen do a commentary on the film. You can watch it with them because they all love it and gush over this movie. But I think Rhys Shearsmith said, if there's something so authentic feeling about it, with a lot of films, you might just know that just off camera there'll be a trailer and a dressing room and a catering truck. And with this, it feels like we're really living that world.
It really does. And it's spectacular. And I think too, it's something that makes watching them now really engaging as well, because you can go to those places and you can feel that sense of dis-ease in a beautiful place.
Yeah.
And it's, there was a place we were filming during the Borderlands that is this kind of old kiln, and it's got ivy all over it, and it's out in the middle of nowhere in the woods and this kind of thing, and it felt creepy as hell when we were out there. And
it really adds something, doesn't it?
Exactly. There's something naturally at odds with these spaces and our modern way of living, and you can't help but feel left of center when you encounter them.
I suppose that's why it's such a British thing. We associate it with Britain because Britain has so much history.
Well, and a lot of your really ancient architecture has avoided being destroyed over the last 100 years. Like it's you have these amazing, drive a bit, hit a church. It's sort of it's one of these things that there are these buildings that have been grown over and forgotten because they're so common it's not worth saving all of them.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
And it's spectacular. It is really great fun to even, I highly recommend to people, it's the time of year for it, to go out there just driving around, find a church, freak yourself out.
Yeah, do a bit of, like in Ben Wheatley's Sightseers. Go do a bit of sightseeing around British countryside.
Exactly. Maybe don't kill so many people,
maybe don't kill
people. Treat yourself.
Amazing. So if you had to pick a favourite then of these two movies?
Oh... I mean, I have to say Blood on Satan's Claw. I watched it a long time ago and it's always stuck with me, and it does have that sort of Christmas horror film kind of vibe to it. And it's just so up my alley. I really like Witchfinder General, but
it's not a whole lot of fun.
It's not. Yeah, it's a hard watch, man. It's a good watch, but it's not one you just like. Oh, I'm just gonna pop that on before bed. Just enjoy a bit of that.
Like Blood on Satan's Claw, I agree. I prefer it, and it's definitely one that is more enjoyable to watch in a kind of horror film way. But there's something I really admire about Witchfinder General. It's powerful and it's quite bold for its age and everything else. Isn't
Absolutely,
it?
Absolutely, and obviously, it inspired a lot in a lot of people.
Yes,
so, and it's. I do think we can't let Blood on Satan's Claw go without talking about Satan's Claw.
We've got to talk about Satan. Yes.
Let's talk about Satan.
Yeah, let's. I mean, because obviously, we get glimpses of it, and you get things like a hand and a claw, and then at the end, you kind of see it in all its glory, don't you?
Or whatever. It looks like it's definitely the Bruce the Shark lesson from Jaws,
it is,
and I think it's just a constant thing. What we imagine is always going to be scarier than what we see.
Yeah, sadly it is. And it doesn't help the fact that it's always kind of... everything in this film is lit quite brightly, and it's like we're seeing too much of that thing,
And it's basic. It's not necessarily bad, but it's what it is? Like, the head is a sort of bat thing.
Yes.
And it's not poorly sculpted, but it's really static. It's doesn't
so
move.
Static. Yeah, it's like in The Exorcist when you see that kind of statue of the demon sort of by the bed. It's like
and then earlier in the film, it's portrayed as this sort of like granny in a sheet kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And but that obviously is meant to be it's slowly building itself. It's growing its parts. Yes. But it sort of just looks a bit wimpy to start with. Then when you see it at the end, it's not really clear through the film that it's been building itself.
So, no, they don't make that very obvious, really, do they?
And I don't think they have to, but it does. If you're going to then show it, it would explain why it was a bit stilted and hopping. It's hopping, which hopping is always a funny motion. You can't hop in a scary way.
I think it could have been a lot more powerful in a lot of ways had we never seen any kind of demonic presence in this town. And it left it a little bit more open to, is this just the young people of this town, or a little bit more ambiguous in that way.
And you know what? Like, I don't know how much it would change the film whether or not it was ambiguous. I think it just leaves one less question to answer. The fact that they're like, no, it's the devil. Don't worry about it. It's
there he is.
Devil. But yeah, the showing it is just, I mean,
it's a bit much. Although this is my way of giving it a pass. It almost again has a feel of like so authentic, like if people put on a performance in the 1700s and they had as part of it the devil, and they made one out of props or cloaks or costumes, or dressed somebody up in a village play.
It's very earnest, isn't it?
Yeah, that's almost what it reminds me of.
You know? It's very earnest, and it's this sort of, they believe it.
Yes.
And so it does work. But there's, it almost feels like the end of this movie wasn't quite sure what to do with itself. And I say that very lovingly because there's some cinematic choices and some editing choices. There's this sort of freeze frame before the final push.
Very weird.
And then it goes
frames.
slow-mo.
Yeah.
And
it's quite abrupt.
And it's not something that's used throughout the film. So I'm like, from a technical perspective, I'm a big fan of the rule of threes. I think if you're going to set up a cinematic language, set it up early, use it 3 times so it's actually a part of the film rather than just springing it on your audience last minute.
Yes.
So it does feel it feels like the kind of thing. I know it wasn't. It does sound like it was intentional because they had to film it that way.
Yes, they did, didn't they? They filmed it with like a slow-mo
Yeah,
thing.
you would have had, because it was on film, so they would have had to make the choice at the time. But like, even knowing that, it feels like a choice that was made to fix something.
100%. It does. That's exactly what I thought. It feels like they've missed a crucial shot or something and they had to do a kind of like edit to mask it or something.
Like maybe the film stock got flashed and so it was all exposed for the rest of that shot, so he just decided to stop it.
It's really interesting. And just the way and again, it's like quite quick. It's like the judge man, he comes straight in, he kind of burns the thing on the fire, credits,
Exactly. It's very abrupt, and it feels just like, okay, done now. And you don't even feel, you're not sure if are people okay? Did what's his name lose his foot? Is it like, again, I suppose the devil dead? It doesn't matter.
No, again, I suppose it emphasizes that feeling of a folk story you tell around the fire, and that's it. It ends with the demon being killed. And
it does. And you know what? You're absolutely right. And that's a really good point, actually. The sort of fireside chat where it ends with the and then he killed
prevailing
them.
over evil.
And then now bedtime.
Exactly, yeah. And it all happily ever after.
Exactly. It's both of them do that to some extent, where it's just like, well...
Yeah, and the Wicker Man, the most abrupt ending of all time. Like, it's just like, whoa, okay, that's it. And Finn.
Exactly. Like... It seems like actually ending on just a big bonfire might be satisfying enough.
It's like when I remember watching that for the first time and going, okay, and at what point is he going to be saved at the last minute? Okay, now what's going to happen? How's he going to escape? Okay, no, he's just dying. And
there's that relentlessness again, though, isn't it? It's that sort of, this happened, and it's happened, and that's what life is like.
And that's the end of the story.
Like, exactly.
It's just like, whoa.
And that's the end of the story. And it is, but I have to say too, despite all that, and I don't think the ending of Blood on Satan's Claw is that successful. I don't think it's not as good as the rest of the film. But it doesn't damage your enjoyment of the film. No. Like, it's not one of those endings where like, oh man, that's rendered the last hour and a half of my life pointless.
Exactly.
It's just like, oh, well, that was
okay then. Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. But honestly, it's such an experience to watch it, and I think it really takes you to another world, and it convinces you of that world, and you're in it, you believe it, and you kind of want to go hang out in it for a little bit, but not too long.
Exactly that. There you go. Well, do you feel like you've learned a little bit more about folk horror on this journey?
I am on this journey now, man. It is there are wrong turns, there are dead ends.
Exactly.
I am on the path. I'm ready to get lost in this hedge maze that is folk horror.
I know, I love it. Come along for the ride. Program yourself a little series of films that may or may not be folk horror,
Exactly. We'll never know.
We'll never know. Thank you so much for joining me, Jen. Where can people find, if they want to find you or find information about projects you've got coming up?
So the best way to find me is on Twitter. Just straightforward, it's at Jen Handorf. It's sort of, it's definitely where I hang out and chat about things. So if anybody wanted to shout me their favorite folk horror films, or if they disagree and just love the ending of Blood on Satan's Claw, then feel free to give me a shout.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, man.
And that's it for this week. Thank you so much for listening, and a huge thank you to my guest, Jen Handorf. What a pleasure it was to have her back on the podcast. So get in touch with us. What did you think of this week's show? And what do you think of Blood on Satan's Claw and Witchfinder General? Are you as big a fan as Jen and I? Get in touch. The email address is evolutionofhorror@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter @evolutionpod or on Facebook. That's facebook.com/evolutionofhorror. And don't forget, there is now also a discussion group. That's where you can join that and you can discuss the podcast and the horror genre with other like-minded listeners. There's an amazing group of people actually involved in the group. In fact, so much so that some of us have even met up for a drink in London. So, it's really, really lovely. Please do come and get involved. That's the Evolution of Horror discussion group that can be found on Facebook. Now, don't forget, you can find Evolution of Horror on any major podcast platform, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Libsyn. And if you get a chance, please do subscribe and leave me a little rating or review. It's really great to read, and it helps give the podcast a boost and get discovered by new listeners. So next week is a very exciting week because we are going to be completing the Unholy Trinity by reviewing the third movie in this collection. The one that is often hailed not only one of the greatest ever folk horror movies, but simply one of the greatest horror movies. Or, in fact, simply one of the greatest movies of all time. One of my absolute personal favourites. I'm going to be joined by journalist Larushka Ivanzadeh. It's her first time on the podcast. She's wonderful. She's brilliant. She writes for the Metro, the Times. She's on BBC, Radio 4, a bunch of other outlets. She's brilliant. She will be joining me to discuss this movie, as it's also her personal favourite. I am, of course, talking about Robin Hardy's 1973 movie, The Wicker Man. That's all that's going to be discussed next week in spoilerific detail. So if you haven't seen The Wicker Man, firstly, what are you doing? Go away and watch it immediately, but especially before next week's podcast so you can listen to the discussion without it spoiling the film. The Wicker Man is available to stream on Now TV, and you can also rent it on Amazon, iTunes, YouTube, all the usual places. And of course, there's a DVD and Blu-ray out there available to order. So join us next week for all of this and more on the Evolution of Horror.